There's a lot that has been said about sacrifices in the temple that has been misconstrued. There's a certain myth that the only way a person could gain atonement for a sin is by offering a sacrifice. Because the Torah actually discusses sacrifices in this week's Torah portion, and last week's Torah portion, and in other Torah portions, and it seems it's a very significant part of Judaism. In fact, there's an entire order of the Mishnah and Talmud that's devoted to the laws concerning sacrifices, offerings. But that's a myth. The Torah only recommends or requires the bringing of an offering, of a sacrifice, for unintentional sins. For example, if a person will eat chametz, unleavened bread, leavened bread, the opposite of unleavened, which is matzah, which you're supposed to eat on Passover, but if you ate leavened bread, you violated a serious biblical transgression, and if you did so unintentionally, you didn't realize that it was chametz, that it was leavened, or you didn't know the law that says you're not allowed to eat it, then you had to bring an atonement. If you committed an intentional sin, the only atonement would be the punishment the Torah assigns for that transgression. If it's something that was done in public and it was brought to a court, they would have to administer whatever punishments the Torah requires, and there are all sorts of punishments. But if you committed a crime unintentionally, then you had to bring a certain atonement. And that wasn't even for all unintentional sins, only for one category of sin, which requires a punishment called kares, being cut off from God, which meant that a person in biblical times would die a premature death, not be executed, but die a premature death. And if a person committed that crime unwittingly, they would have to bring an atonement. Now, why do we bring an atonement for something that is unintentional? Because the reason why a person commits a sin unintentionally is because they have allowed their animal nature to govern them. They have become desensitized to God's will. And therefore, they will do things that they shouldn't be doing, not even realizing that they're doing something wrong. That's not because of human frailty. Sometimes it could be that a person lost his memory, but very often it's because of a desensitization process that occurs because of a person's involvement and immersion in a materialistic, hedonistic society. So they will sometimes do sins without even realizing they're doing it. And according to our sages, in a certain sense, that's even worse than an intentional sin. Because an intentional sin represents a conflict between our good inclination and our evil inclination. And sometimes in a battle, some battles we win, some battles we lose. Sometimes we're stronger, sometimes we're weaker. But when you do something unintentionally, that means that the insensitivity has become so much a part of you, you don't even realize you're doing something wrong. And that's where the animal sacrifice is necessary, because it indicates that it's the animal within us that has become so strong that has allowed us to commit the transgression. But for intentional sins, there is no need for sacrifices. And even for the unintentional ones, now that we don't have the temple and we're not allowed to bring offerings, that itself is part of God's commandments that prohibits us from bringing sacrifices. Therefore, we don't need the sacrifices now. All we need is tshuva, is return to God by making a firm resolution not to commit the sin again, to be more alert, more conscientious. And how do I know that we don't need the sacrifices now? Because it says in the prophets, in the book of Hosea, Uneshalma parim sifatenu, the need for bringing bullocks, as a sacrifice is replaced by our lips, by our study of Torah, when we study the laws of sacrifices, by our prayers, by our confession of our sins and resolve and promise not to do it again. That's what takes the place of sacrifices. Yes, in the Messianic age, when the temple will be rebuilt, we will then again be able to bring sacrifices. But you know what? We won't have to bring sacrifices because, again, our sages in the Midrash tell us that in the Messianic age, the only private sacrifice, I mean sacrifices for sins, will be obsolete. The only one private sacrifice that will still be extant will be the thanksgiving offering, thanking God for all the miracles, and especially for the fact that we were redeemed from exile.